a little bit about that, but I just want to say how excited we are to have Dr. Aurélie Athan with us tonight to talk about reproductive identity, which is a topic that I cannot wait to learn more about. I have many preconceived ideas about what it is, but I know that I'm going to learn a lot more. So I'm very, very excited to hear about it. I want to introduce Dr. Athan. She is a clinical psychologist, researcher, and faculty at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she created the first graduate level courses and certificate program in reproductive and maternal well-being. So cool. Her academic lab focuses on evolving theoretical models, such as matrescence, to better understand the psychology and diversity of reproductive life. She takes a holistic approach in her private practice, supporting both clients and educating providers to recognize the transition to motherhood as a developmental process. Boom. I just want to say that is like the transition to motherhood. It is such a developmental stage, even if we don't all get to go through it. Her newest contribution, Reproductive Identity, an Emerging Concept, was published in 2020 in the American Psychologist and has been adapted to train sexual health professionals in schools and clinics. So we are going to hear from Dr. Athan all about this new and emerging field. And I just want to say again, what a privilege it is to have her here at the Motherhood Center. I've known Aurélie for some time, and we've been talking about these topics, particularly matrescence, which is a word she has brought into common parlance, and really, it really took flight. And it's a word that excited me beyond and has a lot to do with what the Motherhood Center is, which is a center for women who are experiencing perinatal mood and anxiety disorders as they transition to motherhood. So it can be at any part of the journey, but we know that it is a journey and it is not always straightforward. So it's important that we learn about all different kinds of ways of identifying oneself along this journey. And we're going to hear a lot more about that tonight. So I will pop up again at the end, but I'm gonna stop my video and hand it over to Aurélie and just say we're really excited to have you.
Thank you. And before you go, I have to give my gratitude to you. I mean, you've created spaces since the onset for my own education as well with a Women's Mental Health Consortium. When the Motherhood Center opened, I was just over the moon. I feel like we've been waiting for this space and you built it. So thank you. It's an honor to be here and to have you even facilitate this. I'm very grateful.
I was second choice, just so you know. Paige couldn't be here, so I was like, okay, I'll fill in. But thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
The whole team is wonderful, really. So I will, I guess, just get started and jump right in because I'd like to also get to know who's on the other side in terms of the audience. I was asking about, who's signed up, mostly to also know if the topic is what drew you in. And I'm very curious about what background you have professionally. So if this works for you and it's not a distraction, I got onto a little poll thing. And if you can even just use your phone and it has some directions there, and take a minute and you can either in the chat box tell me about it, or you can text it to this poll and it'll be a dynamic feature that then I can share with you to see who's in the audience. It's a multiple choice and you just sort of pick who it is. So, and of course, if you're in a not in a profession that's there, just hit other. So with that, I am going to skip a couple slides to get going. The learning objectives, we're probably not going to cover all of them, but what I do want to do is share the reproductive identity framework. As was shared, I like to theorize. That's really, I'm a theorist by nature, and I think that frameworks are incredibly orienting. They are lenses that help us see the world in a different way, and frameworks come and go because they rise to ascension and then they become outdated when they don't explain the world sufficiently anymore. And I think that this is, I'm hoping that this emerging concept is something that, with your help, with your experimenting with it out in the world, you will see whether it helps you, whether it helps you see something in a new way. And I'm hoping that once you see it, you can't unsee it, because that's the real litmus test. And then we're going to do a quick assessment of how you might be able to explore not only your own reproductive identity or orientation, which is another word I'm going to be talking about with your clients or even yourself. And then we can talk about some potential provider bias that might be active and alive within you or with those who you see. But that takes more time to really look under the hood there. So moving on, if you do really want to read more about it, the paper is called Reproductive Identity and Emerging Concept. And if you go to reproductiveidentity.com, it's free and available. It's not behind a firewall. So you can read, the real details. Okay, so just put this in the chat box. I think it's a lot easier. Before we begin, I just want to ask you, what do you think reproductive identity means? And maybe I have the chat box open so I can see it. And if we get a couple of ideas in there, I'll read them out loud, or you can even put them in the poll box as well. So I think what's happening is I'm just going to do this for a minute, which is I have to activate that, and then we'll come back to here. Okay. So, okay, I lost my chat box, so we're going to keep on going. I'm going to read those later. Let me jump right in. So what is reproductive identity? Basically, if I were to just give the answer away, the most succinct definition would be it's how you self-identify when it comes to your reproductive experiences. It's a very broad term. It's intentionally so that we can be as inclusive as possible. And I believe it also exists on a spectrum. And I'll give some graphics to explain more. It can also, just to make it, simple, it could convey also the conventional categories of parenthood and non-parenthood and everything in between. And we're going to talk about how that might be complicated. It also might be how people make sense of themselves within the sphere of reproduction in general. So let's walk it systematically and see what you think. So why would this be important now? Well, the way I want to talk about it is that I think we're in a profound age of change. Thanks to advances in reproductive technologies and social norms, people of all genders and sexualities now build their families creatively, with or without partners. They delay parenthood, they choose to be childless, or face unwanted infertility. There are also falling birth rates that have emerged as a global trend among all groups from teens to older adults. So here are just some quick statistics of different types of backgrounds that might be operating today. And if I were to take time, we're going to walk through and just show you some of those. So let's talk about assisted reproductive technology, something that perhaps our grandmothers might not have, and grandfathers did not have access to. And the highest use of it is actually congregated where we're located in the tri-state area. And then here are some stats for LGBTQ plus parenting. We have about 40% at this point who are parenting a child. And it's also coming into our media as well. There's a growing diversity in family structures. It is not what it used to be a century ago or mid-century. And of course, we also have voluntary and involuntary childlessness or child-free by choice. In fact, the percentage of childless women has doubled since previous generation, with 50% actually choosing to be so. It's a common lifestyle with more and more people taking that on globally, and it's often married with how many years of education you've had. So in general, here in the US, there is definitely a fertility rate drop, quite significant one, particularly for teens and adolescents. And it often co-occurs with major, larger trends, like let's say an economic recession. And I want us to be thinking about also the pandemic and other connected and related issues. So from 1909 to 2012, we've halved the amount of births. It's not only happening here in the US, it is a global phenomenon. And I'd like you to just take a moment to see this graph. It's quite significant. And I'll show it to you in a different way to show you also how rapid it's been. What took, let's say, the US and the UK, United Kingdom almost 100 years to achieve what we call about, 3 children or less per woman. And the stats are gender biased because we're going to talk about this too. The research has largely only been collected for women for lots and lots of reasons. But this is another reason I want to open it up with reproductive identity so that we can get more and more stats. But what took about 100 years in some places now has only taken about 10 years. That's a phenomenon that we see with a lot of other things like adoption of education or technology. So taken all together, all of these advances in social norms and reproductive technologies, in also the fertility drops, the extension of the lifespan as well. This is one of the most fundamental social changes that has happened in our human history, and you're alive to see it. And I really want to bring that home because this is the landscape that we're living right now. And this is the landscape that your clients are coming to you wondering about who they are and who they can be. What used to be a given might now not be such a given. Reproductive technologies, by the way, are not only about interoceptive, but also contraceptive. So the access to contraception and abortion has also driven a lot of this. But mostly, I want to bring home that it's never been seen before. So together as a learning community, we need to create new words, language, and frameworks to try and help people navigate what must be a very confusing place. This is happening even though most of the world, I actually cannot think of a country that is not pronatalistic, meaning that they are for reproduction of children. One of the major theories that they believe this is the reason that it's happening, and this was pretty cutting edge up until 2020 when the world was turned upside down, is something called the secondary demographic shift. It basically means that the whole world, right, is adopting because of globalization, immigration, all of these different, capitalism, all of these different larger social forces, is undergoing an ideational transformation towards a postmodern attitude of self-actualization, if you remember Maslow, and becoming more you. So the fact that identity is a term of the day is not really coincidence. We're talking about our identities today because we can. The norms that we once really adopted and were handed down from generation to generation have really undergone a seismic shift. And we're experiencing that in many different other domains. But I'm going to be thinking about today, what does that mean for our reproductive intentions and decisions? So on the other side of the screen here, we're going to just focus in on one of the major drivers along with this ideational change is sexuality and gender. The advent of birth control was a game changer. Sociopolitical movements to bring freedoms to all, the liberalization of sexuality and family structures, access to education and employment for women has been a game changer, as well as the rest listed here. And today, I just will quickly put the slide to talk about what is tomorrow going to be? What new ideas and ideational shifts are we going to be experiencing because of the pandemic and all of the health disparities and inequities that we see, the social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, all the barriers that we're seeing for even just access to health and mortality. So let's all keep an eye on it and see what that does. But that's all to say, really, that if you study history long enough, reproductive age has changed and norms have always been shifting. Even just a couple of generations ago, a generation ago, or depending on where you are geographically in the world, it would be perfectly acceptable to build a family this way or that way. There are no actual standards. They just shift with each generation and each location. So I really want us to think about being culturally competent, and when we work with our clients to really narrow down what is the reproductive identity of their culture, what is of their not only the macro system of the globe, but also the subcultures that they are nested in. It's a very important piece that we teach to teachers when they're talking to teenagers in schools, because everybody comes from a different reproductive identity culture within their family. So what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with an individual? This is where I want to marry the macro and the micro. Yes, these are macro trends, and yes, we also have generational and cultural macro forces that shape us. We don't become who we are in a vacuum. We borrow from the water we swim in. But at the end of the day, internally, subjectively, we have to form ourselves in who we are. And part of that is deciding or wondering or exploring this dimension of human experience, which is reproductive life. Well, whether you opt out or in, it's still a dimension of human life that you must confront. And that's why I have this sort of Shakespearean, image here. It is existential. It may not be as intense an existential question for everybody. It depends on how central this is to the core of who you are. But we all at some point will be asked about this or will have questions about it. So let's begin a process, if I may, with how we can just start to organize our thinking around it. Because even in talking with Catherine earlier, identity is a really fuzzy concept. It's complicated. What does that mean? And then what does it mean in this domain? Well, I'm going to just stay on this only briefly because I described already the macro forces on the left. But on the right, what I didn't say enough about, and this would take a whole other lecture, is just how confused people are. You might be experiencing that in your clientele. There are those who have certainty. There are always those. There's a bell curve, those with certainty, extremes of certainty, extremes of uncertainty, and everything in the middle. Everything in the middle often is a mixed bag. And the research is showing that people have inconsistent attitudes about this. They are ambivalent or indifferent or entirely stagnant about how to move forward, how to even begin to wrap their minds around it, and how to even communicate with partners or family members or friends about how this is going to be, including if, let's say, in the case of pregnancy, in an unintentional pregnancy or accidental pregnancy, someone afterwards can say that it was very much wanted. So we have complex reactions to our reproductive experiences. Let's think about something like, our first sexual experiences or first menstruation or any other kind of factor like that. And we have complex feelings about it. So why would someone be very certain about this domain? It's unlikely, and the research is showing it. But I do believe another reason is because there's a lack of education and literacy. There is very much a lack of reproductive education. And this is some of the work we're trying to do, which is to go earlier and earlier. Because when I teach at the graduate level, many of my students are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. And they often say, why haven't we talked about this earlier when I was in my formative self, making other kinds of decisions like my educational decisions or, where I want to live or anything like that. This was another big one. And a lot of times people do not even think about it until they're in crisis. And you often catch your clients in crisis if they've come to you. So we're trying to do a little bit more in getting behind. And many of the women I've talked to in the transition to motherhood or matrescence, when I was doing that research, I found that their pre-story, right, the prequel to what happened, was as important in shaping how they entered that transition. So let's begin in earnest. Let's see if we can make some sense of this. If personal identity is a self-reflexive story about who you are, and it is rooted in your distinct context, and it can be fluid and change over time, then how do we begin to even assess or measure it? Is it categorical? Let's start even with a question of if, the desire for parenthood, whether you even want it. Is it black or white? Well, I've tried to give this framework, and I'll go through it fairly quickly and leave more room in the Q&A at the end to see if this is helpful. And frankly, I've adapted a lot of this from the literature on sexual orientation and gender. Some of this might even be outdated because things are changing all the time, but I thought it might be helpful. So just think about directionality, intensity, centrality, and fluidity, and we'll walk one by one. Maybe you're working with someone, or maybe this is you. Where on the spectrum towards either pole, and I don't want you to think about it as for or against, because it's not being against something, but where are you sort of leaning towards wanting to have children? And we're talking about that definition in a very open-ended way that can happen through heterosexual sex, that can happen through surrogacy, that can happen through adoption, marriage, step parenting, all of the various ways that we build our families today, or opting out. So if you take a moment, and maybe you can even think of a client and how they might be sort of wondering which way they're going and where they are as well with other things in their life, because they often have competing demands. Then intensity. How strong is that direction? Someone might be very much towards child-free, and a number 5, very intense, extreme and intense in that feeling. And that will feel very different than someone who might be sort of in the middle or middling, and who has maybe a 2. By the way, I'm not convinced that in the middle means sort of, both, or that ambivalence captures that, because we may also be a-reproductive, just like being asexual. That would be totally not on that measurement at all. It might be somebody who just does not identify with any of these feelings at all. So this is a little metric, kind of a quick litmus test to see, and take a moment, and perhaps it's good to do your own self-assessment. Now, many of you may already be child-free or have children, and so this is not about becoming one day, but maybe you can do something retrospectively and think about when you actively sort of did something about it, including maybe even sterilization or whatever it is. How strongly did you feel about it? Or you can even think, even after having kids, whether your desire for them is actually not that intense, and sort of you still might have some regret, or maybe going towards child-free. That's part of the process, and I want to normalize that as well. Then centrality. Here, we're going to talk about the other identities in a minute, but I referenced that for everybody, this may not be entirely central to who they are. These other identities might have a lot more salience. Salience is really how important it is and how core to how you understand yourself. So taken all together, and fluidity, by the way, which is what I was sort of mentioning, which is that it can change over time. things happen. People come into children and lose children. Things change. So, taken all together, if I was speaking with someone and I asked them a bit, even verbally, about their directionality, the intensity, the centrality, and the fluidity, I might actually start to hear uh, something, a deeper register. And I want to give you this word because I think it's even more helpful than identity, which is reproductive orientation. And I take this right out of the literature from Worthington on sexual orientation. In fact, that quote is his, but I've removed the word sexual and I put reproductive. So, what if these were predispositions that may be genetically, biologically, environmentally, or socially determined? What if we will never know where all of this sort of desire comes from internally? But it doesn't matter because altogether it orients us. It gives us some guidance in some way of which way we may want to be headed. And I really like the word orientation because it is orienting. And I think for clients, especially who might be particularly confused, giving a little bit of this, language can be um, it can reduce confusion and a lot of times also distress, but also knowing that this may take a while to figure out. It might take a lifetime to figure out. In fact, life circumstances may have brought you to one path or another, but psychologically you're still catching up. And that's what also matrescence was about, is that it's things may be happening, let's say from a biomedical or social place, but psychologically, you're still catching up, trying to understand your self concept and how you feel about your life and what has happened to you as a result of either agency, something that you put into process, or that was entirely out of your control. Agency is an incredibly important aspect of this, and that's why sometimes we wonder in our lab whether this is like other identities or not, because of a number of factors, agency being one of them. So, if we pull back again and we get out of categorical thinking, and instead we see these as pathways that might even intertwine, in the course of a lifetime, you may even live many different reproductive identities. You may change your reproductive orientation. You may, as a result of that happening to you, it means we have diversity in the world, obviously. And that diversity means there are many, many pathways. There's no one predominant right or wrong way to go. And I think, particularly in the study of motherhood, disrupting the unitary model of motherhood, or that there is only one way to do this, rather than thinking of ourselves as individuals going through a reproductive experience, is the thing that really enlightened me to just listen to everybody on this earth who is having questions about their reproductive experiences and which way they kind of want to be headed. Um, and again, this doesn't have to only be about parenthood or non-parenthood, but this is the starting point for this theory. After that, we know there's so much literature out there on the infinite amount of reproductive identities out there. For example, surviving a reproductive cancer is a form of a reproductive identity. Deciding whether or not to preserve your fertility is a formative reproductive identity. So, the other thing that might be interesting before we get into social categories of identity, which are going to be quite important here too, is how else might we understand reproductive orientation from the literature on sexual orientation? Is that, and this is a profound truth, that how we are externally and internally, our attraction or desire, what we feel or perceive inwardly, and our actions, what we do, can be very different. So, what I do and how I feel may not be congruent, and that may or may not bring distress. So we can't assume that just because someone has an internal reproductive orientation of X, that the conduct is Y. Um, Someone may engage in many, many years of reproductive fertility treatments, for example, but never then have a successful outcome of becoming a parent if that's what they're looking to do. Let's say they do not pursue other options like adoption or any other another avenue. Internally, they may still feel very much like a parent. So we're going to talk a little bit about that discordance in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the objective versus the subjective. Is it clear cut when you're talking to someone? Are you really sure you know what their reproductive identity or orientation is? How would you know? Many reproductive experiences are absolutely invisible. As for a child, unless they're walking around holding one, you wouldn't know. And as you know, these conversations can get very uncomfortable. They are highly sensitive. And unfortunately, our culture doesn't treat it as that. Many people are often probed and asked about their reproductive decisions without understanding or respecting how private that is. You know, the kind of classic story is, two people, become married or partnered, and then the next question is, when are you going to start your family? So here are some examples of the confusion of objective versus subjective. Some may love children but not get to have them. Some may have children but regret them. An infertile person may relate more like a parent than not. That's the example I gave. A parent may not feel like one long after a baby arrives. An unintended pregnancy may become a happy accident. A fulfilled parent may lose a child to illness, divorce, or migration. And someone child-free by choice may step parent through marriage. So here are, I think, very ubiquitous examples in the world of how verification is necessary. It's important that we use empowering language and that we ask people to disclose their reproductive status in sensitive ways. We're going to talk about the risk for discrimination against people's reproductive experiences and choices, including whether you get hired or not, including whether you continue in a relationship or not. So in general, don't judge a book by its cover. People rarely self-identify internally as they appear externally. People do not like to be miscategorized, and people seek verification all the time that you actually see them as they see themselves. So how do we get around this? I think my biggest take home is, while I have this handy dandy assessment tool and we'll put it into research and see if it captures anything, I think the reproductive story is the most powerful thing you can assess for. It's not just about getting a life history, but really listening to someone tell you, how did this all begin? Give you their earliest memories, how one thing sort of led to another. What are the different turning points? And narrative psychology, and particularly narrative medicine, is a big thing now. Even at Columbia, we have a narrative medicine program. So I really like narrative, always have since the beginning of my own training, because it puts the subjectivity, well, in this case, back into reproductivity. That is not a smooth sentence, but it's about not taking the facts. It's not just the reproductive facts you're getting in the life history, like how old were you when this happened? It's really having them tell you what it meant to them and how it shaped them, and how, as a result of those experiences, their next step in the road is being shaped. Someone who might have a genetic predisposition for something may be hesitating to move forward with their reproductive life plan. And it's all sort of, caught up also in family and memory and fear. And you really need to hear for that. So sometimes just a big open-ended question can get you much further along, and it keeps you from kind of using the wrong words. So when we do listen to the narrative, even though I've given this slide already, you should also be listening to themes and arcs like a good story, the setbacks. Is there redemption? Was there contamination? Meaning somehow you feel like, you know, you're not worthy anymore in this domain and you shouldn't have children. Those are the places of intervention, certainly for mental health professionals. As for social identity, and this is incredibly important too, from a justice framework, a reproductive justice framework, a counseling framework, we need to know about not only how people self-identify, but also how the world might be categorizing them. So take a minute to read this definition of social identity. And it's about group membership. And as you can see, there's also risk for prejudice and discrimination, depending on whether you're in group or out group. So these are the usual big 8 identities that you might have seen. A lot of kids learn these in school now, thank goodness. So these are the big 8, the classic ones that are there, but they've taken years and years, right, to develop. And my question that I'm posing to you and anyone else listening is, why isn't reproduction there? Isn't it as big as any of these things? Doesn't it shape who we are? Is it the missing one? There are others that are missing, but I think this is a big one. And you can sort of debate with me or to yourself whether you agree. But it also means that there's going to be dominant and subordinate groups, and I want you to think about that, right? So folks who are child-free, voluntarily or involuntarily, would be in the subordinate group, in the marginalized group, because we are in a dominant pronatalistic society. And what does that mean in terms of how they are perceived, welcomed? There's a lot of stigma that is often attached to an out group. And of course, we're going to bring that really important term of intersectionality, which I hope you've all been exposed to. And if you haven't, please do. There's a wonderful TED Talk as well that you can listen to on your own time. But you see, these identities are so important because it's not about just one or the other, it's how they intersect. The complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, combine, overlap, intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So the little test here is, let's start intersecting some things. You can start with your own identity, but I want to make it the big 3. That's sort of my public health slogan, the big 3: gender, sexuality, and reproduction. If we were to put those 3 and start braiding them together like a braid, think about your own. How do those intersections shape who you are and your access to participation in society? If you step back and you're the provider, when someone comes to you with that braiding, how do you react to them based on their intersectionality? And then, of course, continue to braid and weave and braid and weave with the rest of the big 8. So we're coming slowly to a close of the presentation, but I will drive home this piece, which probably, if you're attending this, you know something about the Motherhood Center, you have an interest and a commitment to reproductive health and reproductive rights. So I'm here to say that people, and you know this, are often discriminated against as a result of their reproductive identity and status. And that, like gender, race, class, and sexual orientation, it shares this unfortunate legacy that we're all seeing today show itself in ways that are contemporary for today, but have always been here. So this common stressor may serve to integrate these bodies of work. And I mean that means I think that reproductive life needs its time in the pantheon of identities, where if it's on a multiple choice, if it's on a form, if someone's being asked about other identities, why are we silent on this one? This is the unfortunate legacy I have a lot of questions around, because clearly stereotyping, marginalization, and stigmatization is happening for those in the reproductive um, in the reproductive experience with the reproductive experiences they have. It's happening. We hear it in our clients. So if you were to come and do the full 6-week course with us at Teachers College, we would do a whole history. We would start in the 70s with the UN declaring reproductive health a human right and move forward through time where we converge on a definition that we can all agree on. And then also reproductive justice as an idea comes to play in 1997 with Sister Song. And please do go and visit this site and educate yourselves as well. But it is a human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and to parent them with dignity and respect, which is the additional language that was offered here. So it's not only about if, when, and how, but I would like to say, which is the if, when, how is sort of the classic slogan of reproductive life planning, but I would like to say it's if, when, how, who. When we put it into who, I'm going to just skip here, then it becomes an inalienable human right for us to write our own stories and to self-identify as we see fit. And that is something that hopefully, while it will be constrained by external factors, there is some liberation in knowing that that is our truth to tell. Coming back on this, I do want to say that in our last 3 slides, as I mentioned, not only should it belong in the pantheon, but it's ripe for bias, provider bias specifically. Many lack themselves reproductive literacy and education. I train sometimes residents in these topics. I read a lot of research. Many healthcare providers, reproductive healthcare providers, don't even know some basic things about the reproductive life cycle for themselves, especially. So the lack of self-awareness of their own reproductive identities. Let me actually massage that. If you're a reproductive health specialist, you do know the reproductive life cycle. So if you're in another medical category, you may not know quite a bit or enough about reproductive health. And that's why, in fact, I believe in, even Catherine can chime in, getting our trainees to rotate through reproductive health rotations is incredibly important. And there's a lot of potential for coercion rather than collaboration when making recommendations for reproductive decisions, including contraception, etc. What we really want to enter is collaboration and to be very clear of our own unconscious and implicit bias regarding all the other social identities we have. And there are many, many places that you can start to do that, many trainings. I do want to say the future directions as we wind down is that it might not be our faults as humanity. It really isn't much out there. And there are biases that are in the field of reproductive health as well, internally to the field. There's a near exclusive focus on heterosexual females. There's the marginalization of males and sexual minorities and gender minorities. There is, increasing awareness of, the higher risk status for some women because of maternal mortality, trauma, career, family conflicts. And there really is still a lot of fear-based education rather than kind of looking at it in a more open and positive and affirmative way. And of course, we lack a lot of cultural competence, and we have very much a Eurocentric or American-centric Western ideal as to what a family looks like. So the way out of this, here's just a very quick way to end, is try and have these axioms in mind to normalize the diversity of reproductive experiences, decisions, intentions that kind of bob and weave through life. So get to know the many groups that are explored and underexplored still. Contextualize, always be sensitive to culture, geography, and generational differences. Try and think about it as a developmental process. It's not just matrescence. reproductive identity, like identity development, is a developmental process. You may begin with not knowing and coming into greater and greater knowing. And always verify with your clients if you've understood them right. And try not to pathologize or marginalize. Try not to really understand anything as abnormal until you hear from your client if it's creating distress. And always know that all these reproductive identities are alive and well in the world, whether you know about them or not. So the discrimination is internal as a provider, and of course, external as shaped by social forces. So do your work is really the bottom line. And we'd be very happy to support that process. But I do want to stop here and say that we should open it up for Q&A. And I will stop sharing my screen. And well, maybe what I'll do instead is actually ask you if you do want to go to reproductiveidentity.com and tell us in the lab what topics you're most interested in. I've heard from some colleagues they want to hear about menopause or any other, other topics. I want to hear from you. What are you most interested in? And if you want any more information, you can always go here. So with that, let's open it up to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Aurélie. Like, my mind is kind of like blown. There's so many different ways to think about reproductive identity, many of which I've considered before, but many new ones you've added to the list and ways to think about it in terms of intensity and directionality. It was fascinating. I have my own question, but I'll save it. I see that Yali, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, asked a question about, and she says, or actually I should not assume she, apologies. Yali says, how would you recommend that we encourage clients to share from their personal reproductive narrative, especially if the details fall within minority or stigmatized categories?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's a very multi-layered question.
Hi, Yali.
How would you recommend that we encourage clients to share from their personal reproductive narrative, especially if their details fall within minority or stigmatized categories?
Great question. I think it always starts with just creating a safe space, obviously, to have trust and not to assume that they will disclose any of this with you. I think it's always safe to say that people have many experiences and stories that take a while to reveal themselves. So I think just being very curious and asking, but also giving permission to say you may or may not want to disclose this, or can you give me at least the reasons why you may or may not? Are you afraid I may not understand? What is it about my identities that you think I may hold, right? That may or may not feel resonant with you, or that I may or may not understand. I think a lot of times this idea of verification and being understood, particularly if you're in a marginalized group and you think that the provider is not. I think I just often ask a lot of times just for a memory. Sometimes just asking people to tell me a memory or a story or an event or an experience, just we get to talk about that. And then I get to ask, well, what did that mean for you? How has that shaped who you are? If you had to say that makes me this or that, if that's how you even see yourself. So for me, it's narrative, always telling a story.
Okay, excellent. It makes me think, how do you even begin that? I as somebody who has not, I have my sort of medical way of thinking as a reproductive psychiatrist, but I feel like, I may be limiting the questions or limiting the answers given the questions I'm asking. So would you mind giving sort of a general overview of how you might introduce this so that it becomes part of the dialogue, that their narrative on this kind of emerging topic, or, as you are defining it broadly, comes into the dialogue? I'd be curious how you might introduce that.
I almost thought to reverse it. I think people find it really helpful to know they have a reproductive identity. I don't even
Yeah,
need to know
yeah.
what it is, right? It's empowering, right? Because they know they have other identities, right? And what about this one? So just to not render it invisible anymore and say, hey, did you know that all people have a reproductive identity? They may not know what it is. You may agree or disagree with that, but certainly the world may perceive you one way or another, and it may be as you may be discriminated against, you may be invited to some things based on your reproductive identity, and are you disclosing your reproductive identity in places that are you sure it's a safe place to even talk about those things, right? I start with giving it as a right that you have. You may not know what it is, but did you know you have it? And did you know that the world shapes you according to it, or that you are contributing to the world based on your decisions? I think that there already just makes people go, oh, it's not a given. It's not just me. It's a thing. And that's how we started, right? Even Catherine, with just frameworks. So I don't have a clear directive for you all. We just put the paper out in terms of giving it as a framework, as a conceptual framework. But I always go in with a place, even in my class, everyone here has a reproductive identity. Can you what does that even mean to you? And that gets the wheel started.
I like that. Hold on, I'm going over the question, or they seem to be in the chat. What are your thoughts? This is from Mallory. What are your thoughts of using the language mother versus birthing person? Birthing person is more inclusive, however. For many people, the term mother is very sacred and important. What disclosures do you have for using the terms, particularly as a healthcare provider trying to advocate for issues such as PMADs, while identifying the importance of the label of mother for some people and not excluding others?
Yeah. Great question. And we were even talking about that right before. I mean, it's happening live as we speak. I'm actually very excited about the linguistic richness that is being elaborated in this time that we live in. I mean, what a bother. Up until now, we just had like two options, right? So, we have diversity and it's happening, and we're gonna feel our way through it. What I do know is that once somebody owns their identifier or finds it in their community, a lot of times there's sort of like enclaves, people come together and they create their language and their community, their identifiers. So there's social groups, and then there's also individuals that people feel very, very loyal to them. So just from the in-group perspective, it can feel difficult to use a different linguistic base. So it's a both and. At the same time, when you use it, you might exclude someone else. So I think speaking always from the first person and just saying that's how I see myself. I think even, even think about couples counseling or whatever, don't say you, say me. That brings a lot of, I think, just, respect for the person speaking from their own internal truth. Having said that, though, we also cannot stay only knowing what we know. I think, again, it's being educated, and also it's all about everyone having a seat at the table. Is there something about the word that doesn't give access to something? That's, to me, the dividing line. If by saying a word, then I cannot get my health care, that's where we have to have real conversations. And I think, Catherine, you were saying what's interesting, because it's in the places of policy where this is also incredibly important, because it means, like we said, access. So as I said, the work is happening on the ground now, and there's so much work to be done, but I'm very, very excited about the linguistic diversity And then I think we can figure it out respectfully, because now we have these different identities. They exist in the world, so they need their names. They need their names and they need to be included in the conversation.
Great. It makes me think, and we've thought this since the minute we chose the name for the Motherhood Center, right? Already we're opening and closing doors, which, you know, our intention was not to be exclusive on one hand, but on the other hand, to allow a place for the identity of the burgeoning mother. And now it's changed since we opened 4 years ago. And we are faced with many questions and people who are challenging the name and the identities within. So it's exciting, albeit difficult sometimes, but I love a challenge. So it's fun and exciting to begin to think about what naming does, right? Like you said, it's important to have a seat at the table. It defines something. It helps you feel included. And yet once you name it, it necessarily excludes.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of compassion all the time for any of this process, because language is a very, very tricky thing. Like you said, so I say it's both and.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Both and. And
Yeah.
so can it be that? Can it be that? And so that's the trick. Let's see. And to, as you know, folks in my lab too, and I wonder, Olivia, if you're here, I meant to put before we end, I do want to give a shout out to the lab. You know, the process of being humble and curious is what's going to get us through, I believe. And of course, this is a very deep discussion.
Yeah, I'll end with a last comment. I'm not sure who made it, but so I apologize, but someone has said in violent agreement that just the acknowledgement of a reproductive identity is important and purposeful, which is such a beautiful way to say that if you know nothing about it and you have those words, you can introduce it into the